January 17, 1945. The wind howled across the frozen fields of Camp Shanks, New York, slicing through the barbed wire like invisible razors. Snow fell in thick, wet clumps, coating the wooden barracks in white silence. Inside Processing Building C, 32 German prisoners of war stood in two rigid lines, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. They wore the same tattered uniforms they'd been captured in 3 weeks earlier, thin gray-green wool tunics designed for autumn maneuvers, not the brutal winter of the Ardennes. Frost clung to their eyebrows. Their fingers, purple and swollen, could barely grip the identification cards handed to them by an American corporal who looked no older than 20. Outside, American soldiers moved past the windows in thick olive-drab overcoats, their boots crunching through 8 inches of fresh snow, steam rising from tin cups of coffee clutched in gloved hands. One of the German prisoners, a former Oberstleutnant named Klaus Mehring, watched them through the frosted glass and felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to confusion, a fundamental unraveling of everything he'd been taught about his enemy. He turned to the man beside him, a Lancer from Bavaria named Ernst, and whispered a question that would echo through the testimonies of thousands of German POWs held on American soil during the final years of the Second World War. Why are they helping us? The answer to that question would challenge everything these men believed about the war, about their enemy, and ultimately about themselves. To understand the shock these prisoners experienced, one must first understand what they expected. For years, German soldiers had been conditioned by a relentless propaganda machine that painted the Americans as weak, decadent, and incapable of true martial spirit. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, had crafted a narrative of American society as a mongrel nation, culturally bankrupt, racially impure, obsessed with material comfort at the expense of discipline and sacrifice. German newsreels showed American soldiers as poorly trained conscripts, led by incompetent officers, propped up only by industrial output they hadn't earned through superior culture or willpower. The message was clear. Americans could build tanks and planes, but they lacked the Kampfgeist, the fighting spirit, to use them effectively. They were soft. They would crumble under pressure. This narrative was reinforced in training camps across the Reich. Young soldiers were told that if captured, they would face brutal treatment, starvation, forced labor, perhaps execution. The Americans, they were assured, did not respect the Geneva Conventions. After all, they came from a society that valued profit over honor, individual comfort over collective duty. Why would such people show mercy to their enemies? By late 1944, this worldview was hardening into desperation. The Wehrmacht was collapsing on both fronts. Millions of German soldiers faced a terrible calculus: surrender to the Soviets in the East, where stories of retribution and prison camps in Siberia circulated like ghost stories, or surrender to the Anglo-Americans in the West, where the treatment was rumored to be better but still uncertain. For most, the choice was clear. If capture was inevitable, better the Americans or British. But better was a relative term. Few expected kindness. Fewer still expected what they would actually receive. Klaus Mehring had been captured on January 3, 1945, during the final collapse of the German counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge. His unit, the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, had been cut off near St. Vith, surrounded by elements of the American 7th Armored Division. For 6 days, they'd fought in temperatures that plunged to 15 degrees below zero. Their winter clothing had never arrived. Supply lines had collapsed. Men wrapped themselves in blankets scavenged from destroyed homes. Some stuffed newspapers under their tunics for insulation. Frostbite claimed more casualties than enemy fire. When the order finally came to surrender, Mehring felt not shame but relief that the cold would finally end. But the cold didn't end. Not immediately. After their capture, Mering and his comrades were marched 3 miles through knee-deep snow to a temporary holding area, a muddy field surrounded by concertina wire. They were searched, their weapons confiscated, their personal items catalogued. Then they waited. 4 hours, they stood in the snow, still wearing their inadequate uniforms, watching American soldiers set up tents and field kitchens. Some of the Germans began to shiver uncontrollably. One man collapsed. Medical orderlies, American medics with red crosses on their helmets, rushed to him, lifted him onto a stretcher, carried him into a heated tent. This was the first shock. The second came an hour later, when the prisoners were herded into formation and an American officer, speaking through a German-speaking interpreter, informed them they would be transported to a processing camp in the United States. The United States. Not a local holding pen. Not a work camp in France or Belgium. America. The idea seemed absurd. The war was still raging. Why would the Americans waste resources shipping prisoners across the Atlantic? But that's exactly what happened. The journey across the ocean took 14 days. The German prisoners were loaded onto converted Liberty ships, cargo vessels hastily refitted with tiered bunks in the holds. Conditions were cramped, the air below deck stale and thick with the smell of unwashed men. Yet even here, the contrasts began to emerge. The food, while plain, was abundant. Twice a day, American mess crews distributed rations: canned stew, white bread, canned fruit, coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking for 2 years. The bread was soft, almost sweet. Some of the prisoners ate until they were sick, their stomachs unaccustomed to fullness. Others hoarded food in their pockets, unable to believe the supply would continue. Mering, bunked on a lower tier near the aft bulkhead, kept a scrap of paper on which he scratched notes each night: observations, questions, fragments of thought. On the 3rd night at sea, he wrote, "They feed us better than our own officers fed us in the last year of the war." Why? It was a question without an easy answer. The United States had ratified the Geneva Convention of 1929, which stipulated that prisoners of war must be housed, fed, and treated humanely. But adherence to international law didn't fully explain the scale of what these men were experiencing. After all, the Soviets had also signed the Geneva Convention, yet German POWs in Soviet hands faced starvation, forced labor, and death rates that approached 50% in some camps. The difference wasn't just legal, it was philosophical, cultural, economic. America, in 1945, was a nation of staggering abundance. Its factories churned out material at rates that defied comprehension. Its agricultural output could feed not only its own population and military, but also its allies and, as it turned out, its enemies. To the American military planners, feeding German prisoners adequately wasn't an act of charity. It was a logistical footnote, a minor line item in a budget that already dwarfed the GDP of most nations. But the prisoners didn't see budgets or logistics. They saw food. They saw warmth. And when the ships docked at New York Harbor on January 16, 1945, they saw something else entirely. The Statue of Liberty rose out of the gray winter mist like a vision from another world. Most of the German prisoners had never traveled beyond the borders of the Reich before the war. Some had never seen the ocean. Now, crammed onto the deck of a Liberty ship as it glided past Ellis Island, they stared at the Manhattan skyline in silence. The skyscrapers seemed impossible, towers of steel and glass, untouched by war, their windows glowing with electric light even in the afternoon. There were no ruins, no bombed-out husks of buildings, no craters in the streets. The city was whole, alive, prosperous. For men who had left behind a Germany in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, its infrastructure shattered, its population starving, the sight was incomprehensible. This was the enemy? This nation of wealth and plenty was the same nation they'd been told was on the verge of collapse? Ernst, standing beside Mering at the rail, muttered something under his breath. Mering asked him to repeat it. Ernst looked at him, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "We were lied to," he said. That realization, simple, devastating, would repeat itself 1,000 times over in the days and weeks that followed. At Camp Shanks, the processing began. The prisoners were divided into groups of 50 and marched into a series of Quonset huts. Inside, the huts were heated by pot-bellied stoves, the warmth so sudden and intense that some men swayed on their feet, dizzy with the contrast. American soldiers directed them to wooden benches. They were told to remove their uniforms. Medical personnel moved down the rows, checking for lice, for wounds, for signs of disease. Mering noticed that the medics wore rubber gloves and face masks, but their touch was professional, not cruel. When one of the German prisoners, a young boy who couldn't have been older than 17, flinched at the sight of a needle, an American nurse spoke to him in broken German. "It's okay. Just a vaccine. You're safe." Safe. The word hung in the air. After the medical inspection, the prisoners were led into another room, this one filled with long tables stacked high with clothing. American soldiers stood behind the tables, distributing items as each prisoner passed. Mering, still in his thin undershirt, shivering despite the warmth of the room, stepped forward. The soldier behind the table, a bored-looking private with a southern drawl, barely looked at him. "Size?" he asked. Mering didn't understand. The interpreter stepped forward, repeated the question in German. Mering stammered out his measurements. The private pulled items from the stacks with mechanical efficiency. Wool trousers, a flannel shirt, a heavy knit sweater, a thick overcoat, olive drab, lined with fleece. Then socks. 2 pairs. Underwear. A wool cap. Gloves. Boots, real leather boots, new, unscuffed. Mering stood there, holding the pile of clothing, unable to move. The weight of it in his arms was almost absurd. This was more clothing than he'd been issued in 2 years of Wehrmacht service. These boots alone were better than anything he'd worn since before the war. And they were giving it to him. To a prisoner. An enemy. He looked at the American private, searching for some sign of contempt, some acknowledgment of the transaction's strangeness. But the private was already waving him forward, calling for the next man in line. It was routine, mundane. That, somehow, made it worse. As Mering pulled on the clothes, each layer a revelation of warmth and weight, he felt the question rising again in his chest. Why? Why this generosity toward men who had, weeks earlier, been trying to kill them? He turned to the interpreter, a German-American corporal named Fischer. "I don't understand," Mering said. "These clothes, this treatment. Why?" Fischer looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "Pity, maybe. Or sadness." "Because that's what we do," he said simply. Then he moved on to the next prisoner. The answer, of course, was more complicated than that. But in its simplicity, Fischer had touched on something essential. The treatment of German POWs in American camps was the result of multiple intersecting factors: legal, strategic, ideological, and cultural. The United States military, under the direction of the War Department, had determined that strict adherence to the Geneva Conventions was not just a moral obligation but a strategic asset. If American prisoners held by Germany and Japan were to have any hope of humane treatment, the U.S. had to set an example. Moreover, well-treated POWs were less likely to resist, less likely to attempt escape, and more likely to provide valuable intelligence. By 1945, with victory increasingly certain, there was also a forward-looking calculation. Germany would need to be rebuilt after the war. The men held in American camps would return home. What they said about their treatment would shape German perceptions of America for generations. But beyond strategy, there was something else, something harder to quantify. It was rooted in a particular American conception of abundance and fairness, a belief that even enemies deserved baseline dignity, that cruelty was unnecessary when security could be maintained through order and plenty. This wasn't universal. American treatment of Japanese Americans during the war revealed the limits of this ideology, but for European POWs, particularly Germans, the policy was remarkably consistent. Feed them, house them, keep them busy with work, and show them that the American system, for all its flaws, was fundamentally different from the totalitarian regimes they'd served. For the prisoners, this policy translated into daily experiences that bordered on the surreal. At Camp Shanks, after being issued their new winter clothing, the prisoners were marched to the mess hall for their first full meal on American soil. The hall was a cavernous wooden structure, lined with long tables and benches. Steam rose from serving trays at the front of the room. The smell hit them first: roasted meat, fresh bread, something sweet and unfamiliar. The prisoners shuffled forward in line, each receiving a metal tray divided into compartments. American cooks, working behind a steam table, ladled food onto each tray with brisk efficiency: a thick slice of roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, a roll with butter, a slice of apple pie, a cup of coffee. Mering stared at his tray. It was more food than he'd seen in a single meal in 3 years. He carried it to a table, sat down, and looked around. The other prisoners were eating in stunned silence, forks moving slowly, as if the food might disappear if they ate too quickly. Some men wept openly, tears running down their faces as they chewed. Others sat motionless, staring at their trays, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they'd been told. Ernst, sitting across from Mering, put down his fork. His hands were shaking. "This is a trick," he said quietly. "They're fattening us up for something." But days passed, and the food kept coming. Breakfast: oatmeal, eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice. Lunch: soup, sandwiches, fruit. Dinner: meat, vegetables, potatoes, dessert. The portions were consistent, the quality high. There was no degradation, no sudden withdrawal of privileges. This was simply how the camp operated. In his makeshift journal, Mering wrote, "We eat better here than we did before the war. My father, a factory worker in Essen, never ate beef more than once a month. Here, we have it almost every day. What does this say about them? What does it say about us?" The clothing was the same. Every prisoner was issued a full set of winter gear: coats, boots, gloves, hats. The coats were U.S. Army surplus, dyed to distinguish POWs from active soldiers, but they were identical in quality to what American troops wore. The boots were new. When a prisoner's boots wore out, he could request a replacement. The requests were granted without question. This was not incidental. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the coldest in decades. Across Europe, soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite, trench foot, exposure. In Germany, civilians froze in unheated apartments, their coal rations exhausted. In Soviet POW camps, German prisoners died by the thousands, their bodies buried in mass graves. But in American camps, German prisoners stayed warm. The psychological impact of this was profound. These men had been raised in a society that valorized hardship, sacrifice, and collective suffering. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy in part on the idea that strength came from endurance, that comfort was decadence, that true warriors embraced deprivation. And yet here they were, prisoners of war, being given coats and boots and food, not as a reward, but as a baseline standard. It didn't fit. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some prisoners clung to old explanations. The Americans were soft, they said. This kindness was weakness. It proved that America lacked the discipline to wage total war. But these explanations grew thinner with each passing day, hollowed out by the relentless consistency of their treatment. Others began to question everything. Among the prisoners at Camp Shanks was a man named Friedrich Volker, a former schoolteacher from Stuttgart who had been drafted in 1943 at the age of 38. Volker had never been a fervent Nazi. He joined the party in 1937 because it was necessary for his career, not out of ideological conviction, but he'd believed in the war. Or at least, he'd believed in the narrative, that Germany was defending itself against encirclement, that the Allies sought to destroy the German people, that the Reich represented order against chaos. In the camp, Volker kept to himself, observing, thinking. He noticed things. He noticed that the American guards, while armed, rarely raised their voices. He noticed that prisoners who caused trouble were isolated, not beaten. He noticed that the camp had a library, a small room filled with books in German, donated by churches and relief organizations. He noticed that prisoners were allowed to send letters home, that the Red Cross inspected the camp regularly, that complaints about conditions were logged and, occasionally, addressed. One afternoon in late January, Volker stood in line at the camp's supply depot, waiting to request a new pair of gloves. His old pair, the ones issued 2 weeks earlier, had torn at the seams. As he waited, he watched an American supply sergeant sorting through crates of clothing, checking items off a list, barking orders at a younger private who was struggling to stack boxes. The sergeant was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and a lined face. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this job 1,000 times. When Volker reached the front of the line, he held up his torn gloves and, in halting English, said, "New gloves, please." The sergeant barely looked up. "Size?" "Medium." The sergeant reached into a crate, pulled out a pair of gloves, tossed them onto the counter. "Next." Volker picked up the gloves, hesitated, then asked, "Why you do this?" The sergeant looked at him, finally meeting his eyes. "Do what?" "Give us these things. We are prisoners. Enemies." The sergeant's expression didn't change. He shrugged. "Your people. People need gloves in winter." Then he turned back to his crates. Volker walked away, clutching the new gloves, and for the first time since his capture, he felt something close to shame. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it universal. Some prisoners remained loyal to the ideology they'd fought for, clinging to the belief that the war was just, that Germany's cause was righteous, that their suffering had meaning. These men viewed their treatment in American camps with suspicion, as a form of psychological warfare designed to break their spirits. They refused to engage with their captors, refused to read the books in the camp library, refused to acknowledge the contradiction between what they'd been told and what they were experiencing. But others, men like Mering, like Volker, began to change. It happened slowly, in small increments. A warm coat on a freezing day. A cup of coffee offered without contempt. A medic treating a wound with the same care he'd give an American soldier. Each of these moments chipped away at the edifice of propaganda, exposing the hollowness beneath. By February 1945, Camp Shanks held over 3,000 German POWs. The camp was well organized, almost mechanical in its efficiency. Prisoners were assigned to work details, farm labor, road construction, maintenance, under supervision but without brutality. They were paid for their work in camp scrip, which could be used to purchase items at the camp canteen: cigarettes, candy, toiletries. The canteen was stocked with goods that hadn't been available in Germany for years. A Hershey bar cost 10 cents. Prisoners who'd spent the last 2 years scrounging for food stood in line to buy chocolate. The absurdity of it was almost too much to bear. In his journal, Mering wrote, "Today I bought a chocolate bar with money I earned fixing fences." The American guard who supervised us told a joke while we worked. I laughed. I don't know what this makes me, a traitor or just a man who is tired of hating. The symbolic weight of the clothing, those coats, those boots, became a recurring motif in the testimonies of German POWs. In interviews conducted after the war, many former prisoners cited the moment they were issued winter gear as a turning point, the instant when their perception of the enemy began to shift. The clothing was tangible proof of a system that, whatever its flaws, prioritized human dignity over vengeance. It was also a stark contrast to their own experience under the Reich. German soldiers, particularly those drafted late in the war, often received substandard equipment. Winter clothing, when it arrived at all, was frequently inadequate, thin coats, poor quality boots that fell apart in the snow. Supply shortages meant that frontline units went without essentials while rear echelon officers hoarded resources. The Wehrmacht, for all its vaunted discipline, was a hierarchy riddled with inefficiency and corruption. Soldiers knew this. They'd lived it. To then be captured and immediately outfitted with superior gear by the enemy was a revelation. It suggested that the problem wasn't scarcity, it was priorities. The Americans had chosen to equip their prisoners well. The Reich had chosen not to equip its own soldiers adequately. The comparison was damning. One POW, a former corporal named Hans Dietrich, wrote in a letter to his wife, intercepted and translated by camp censors, "The Americans gave me a coat warmer than any I wore in the Wehrmacht. I do not understand this. I do not know what it means. But I know I will never forget it." By March 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. In American POW camps, the prisoners listened to news broadcasts, heavily censored but informative enough, and understood that the Reich was collapsing. For some, this brought despair. For others, it brought a strange sense of relief. The war would end. They would survive. Volker, the former schoolteacher, spent his evenings in the camp library, reading American books translated into German, The Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, Histories of the American Revolution. He began to see patterns, themes of individual rights, of distrust toward centralized power, of a deep cultural belief in opportunity and reinvention. These ideas were foreign to him, shaped as he'd been by a culture that prioritized duty, hierarchy, and collective identity. But they fascinated him. One evening, he struck up a conversation with the camp librarian, an American private named Elliot who spoke fluent German, his grandparents having emigrated from Hamburg in the 1890s. Volker asked him, "Why does your country treat us this way?" "We tried to destroy you." Elliot leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because we believe that people can change. That you're not defined by the worst thing you've done. And maybe because we have enough food, enough resources, that we don't have to be cruel. Cruelty is easy when you're desperate. But we're not desperate." Volker absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. "You think we can change?" "I think you already are." The camp's proximity to New York City meant that some of the prisoners, particularly those assigned to work details outside the camp, occasionally glimpsed broader American society. They saw civilian cars on the roads, thousands of them, far more than they'd ever seen in Germany. They saw farms with modern equipment, houses with electric lights, stores with windows full of goods. They saw black soldiers in the U.S. Army, a sight that initially shocked them. Nazi propaganda had insisted that America's racial diversity was a fatal weakness, but which gradually forced them to confront the complexity of the nation that had defeated them. Not all of these observations led to enlightenment. Some prisoners clung to their prejudices, interpreting what they saw through the lens of Nazi racial ideology. But others, worn down by the relentless evidence of their own misinformation, began to question. If they'd been lied to about American weakness, about American disunity, what else had they been lied to about? The question was dangerous. To fully pursue it meant dismantling the entire worldview that had justified the war, the sacrifices, the atrocities. It meant accepting complicity. For some, that was too much. But for others, it became the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. April 1945. News reached the camp of President Roosevelt's death. The prisoners expected celebration among the American soldiers, or at least indifference. Instead, they witnessed grief. Guards who had been jovial the day before moved through the camp in silence, their faces drawn. The flag was lowered to half-mast. In the mess hall, a chaplain held a memorial service, and prisoners, standing in the back of the room, listened as the chaplain spoke of Roosevelt's vision for a world of peace and justice. Mering, standing beside Ernst, watched the Americans bow their heads in prayer. He felt a strange kinship in that moment, a recognition that these men, like him, were human, capable of sorrow, of hope, of ideals larger than themselves. It was not a comfortable feeling. It would have been easier to hate them. That night, he wrote, their president died, and they mourned. When Hitler dies, will we? Or will we feel relief? The war ended in May. The camps erupted in confusion. Jubilation among some prisoners who saw the end of the conflict as a chance to go home, despair among others who understood that home was now under Soviet occupation. The American authorities began the slow process of sorting prisoners by origin, determining who could be repatriated and who could not. For those held in camps across the United States, the months following VE Day were a strange limbo. They remained prisoners, but the urgency of their detention had evaporated. The camps became almost mundane, small towns unto themselves, with routines and hierarchies and even a kind of normalcy. Some prisoners took classes, learning English or vocational skills. Others played sports, organized theater productions, carved small mementos from wood. And they continued to receive their coats, their boots, their meals, 3 times a day, every day, without fail. In August 1945, after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Volcker sat in the camp library with Eliot, the librarian, listening to the radio broadcast. The descriptions of the destruction were almost impossible to comprehend. Entire cities erased. Tens of thousands dead in an instant. Eliot's hands shook as he adjusted the radio dial. "This is what you fought," Volcker said quietly. "This is what defeated you. Not us. This." He gestured toward the radio. Eliot looked at him, his face pale. "Yeah, and it scares the hell out of me." They sat in silence for a long time. "Finally," Volcker said, "you gave us coats. In the middle of a war that produced this," he pointed at the radio again, "you gave us coats. I don't know what that means, but it has to mean something." Eliot didn't respond. But he didn't disagree. Over the following months, the repatriation process accelerated. Prisoners were loaded onto ships and trains, sent back to a Germany that no longer existed as they'd known it, a country divided, occupied, bombed into ruin. As they departed, many carried with them the clothes they'd been issued, those coats, those boots. Some wore them on the journey home. Others kept them as mementos, tangible proof of an experience that defied easy explanation. Mering returned to Essen in October 1945. His city was unrecognizable, rubble and ash, skeletal buildings, streets filled with refugees and displaced persons. His family home was gone, destroyed in an RAF bombing raid. His father had died in the final weeks of the war. His mother and sister had fled east and vanished. He was alone. He wore his American coat through the winter of 1945 to 1946, the coldest winter Germany had endured in decades. The coat kept him alive. It became his most valuable possession. More valuable than currency, more valuable than the meager rations he received from Allied relief agencies. Other Germans, seeing the coat, asked where he'd gotten it. He told them, "The Americans gave it to me when I was their prisoner." The responses varied. Some people scoffed, dismissing the story as propaganda. Others listened in silence, absorbing the implication. A few, those who'd survived the Eastern Front, who'd been held in Soviet camps, looked at the coat with something like longing, as if it represented not just warmth but a parallel history, a version of the war in which mercy had been possible. Volker, repatriated to Stuttgart, found work as a translator for the American occupation authorities. He never spoke openly about his time in Camp Shanks, but he kept a small notebook in which he'd copied passages from the books he'd read in the camp library. One passage, from Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, he'd underlined twice. Man, unlike any other thing organic or inorganic in the universe, grows beyond his work, walks up the stairs of his concepts, emerges ahead of his accomplishments. He returned to teaching in 1947, working in a school rebuilt from ruins. His students, children born into the wreckage of the Reich, had no memory of the war's beginning, only its end. He taught them history, language, literature. He taught them to question, to think, to resist simplicity. When they asked him about the war, he told them, "I learned more as a prisoner than I did as a soldier. I learned that kindness is not weakness, that abundance need not breed cruelty, that we were wrong about many things." The story of German POWs and their treatment in American camps became, in the post-war years, a quiet counter-narrative to the dominant images of wartime brutality. It was not widely publicized. There were too many other atrocities to document, too many other injustices to address. But among those who experienced it, the memory endured. Letters, diaries, interviews, preserved in archives, slowly digitized, gradually accessible, reveal a consistent pattern. Shock at the contrast between expectation and reality, confusion at the generosity, and ultimately, for many, a fundamental reassessment of the ideology that had led them into war. The coats, the boots, the food, they were not grand gestures. They were, from the American perspective, simply logistics, the baseline application of law and policy. But to the men who received them, they were symbols of a larger truth. That systems matter, that choices matter, that abundance can coexist with decency if the will exists to make it so. This is not to romanticize American actions. The United States' conduct during World War II was marked by profound contradictions. The internment of Japanese Americans, the segregation of its own military, the decision to use atomic weapons. The treatment of German POWs was exceptional, influenced by racial attitudes that did not extend equally to all enemies or even all allies. But within that specific context, the policy worked. It demonstrated that even in total war, even when facing an enemy responsible for monstrous crimes, it was possible to maintain a standard of decency, not as a sentimental gesture, but as a reflection of values deeper than expediency. 70 years later, the last of those prisoners are gone. Mehring died in 1998, in a small apartment in Cologne. His American coat had long since worn out, but he'd kept the buttons, stored in a wooden box with a few photographs and letters. Volker died in 2003, in a nursing home in Stuttgart, his notebooks bequeathed to a local archive where they remain, largely unread. Ernst, the Bavarian Lancer, emigrated to Canada in 1952 and never spoke of the war. But their testimonies remain, fragments of a collective experience that challenges easy narratives about victors and vanquished, about good and evil, about the nature of power. They were given coats in winter, boots that fit, food that nourished, not because they deserved it, but because their captors believed that all people, even enemies, retain an irreducible dignity. It was a belief born of abundance, of democratic ideals, of a cultural aversion to cruelty that, however imperfectly applied, nevertheless shaped policy in profound ways. And so, in the frozen fields of Camp Shanks, in the mess halls and barracks and supply depots scattered across the American landscape, thousands of German soldiers confronted a question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Why are you helping us? The answer, as Fisher the interpreter had said, was simple and unbearably complex. Because that's what we do. Because systems that respect human dignity, even under pressure, reveal something essential about themselves and about the societies they represent. Because a coat given to an enemy in winter is not just a coat. It's a statement of principle, a wager on the future, a refusal to let hatred dictate the terms of existence. And because, in the end, the men who wore those coats carried them home, not as trophies, but as questions. Questions that would shape Germany's post-war reconstruction, questions that would inform a generation's understanding of democracy, questions that would echo through the decades as Europe rebuilt itself on the ruins of fascism. The coat was just a coat. But it was also a lesson, delivered not through lectures or propaganda, but through the simple, relentless consistency of decency. And for men like Klaus Mehring, standing in the cold, watching American soldiers move past with their coffee and their gloves, the lesson was this, that the ideology he'd been taught was a lie. That the enemy he'd been told to hate was more humane than the regime he'd served. That warmth, offered freely to a stranger, could break down walls that years of indoctrination had built. It was a lesson written in wool and leather, in stitches and seams, in the weight of a coat that kept him alive through the winter. And it was a lesson he never forgot.